Hello, everyone. As we wait for people to jump on, sorry we were a couple minutes late, had some technical issues here at the beginning that hopefully are resolved, and Claire is jumping on momentarily. So we'll just go ahead and begin. At the Millicent Rogers Museum, we are located on ancestral lands of Tiwa-speaking people known today as the Red Willow people of Taos Pueblo. We strive to deepen our relationship with the Red Willow people through collaboration while acknowledging and honoring the complex history of the Red Willow people, past, present, and future generations. We express gratitude to this land and to the Taos Pueblo elders and ancestors who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Welcome to Millicent Unplugged. Tonight's topic is Regional Treasures, a conversation about Santos. Santos offer a doorway to stories of deeply rooted religious practice, family, community lifeways, regional natural resources, and the indelible spirit of people traversing economies through trade and commerce over time, while also retaining and sharing cultural traditions. Santos can also encourage conversations about complex histories and expanded viewpoints, from religious iconography conveying the techniques and materials of the European Renaissance to the emergence of a unique regional art form in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. Both Millicent Rogers Museum and Regis University are home to extensive Santos collections, exploring the larger landscape of Santos collections among regional organizations may impact stories and perspectives as we find resonance with the larger regional voice. I'm Karen Chertok, Director of Education at MRM, joined tonight by Sarah Francis, photographer, author, speaker, museum friend, and volunteer moderator, and MRM curator Claire Motzinger. Hi, Claire, glad you jumped on. You were able to get on. Sorry about the tech problem. We're happy also to welcome Hannah Miller, Associate Professor in Archives and Digital Collections Department Head at Regis University's Dayton Memorial Library. Hannah holds a Bachelor of Art History and Master's of Library Science degree. She has been working with art and cultural heritage collections in academic and nonprofit environments for nearly 20 years and is passionate about intersections between art and archives and the ways in which archives can be used as an agent for social justice. Thank you for joining us in the audience. Please use the chat feature and we'll highlight audience comments throughout the program. And also we will allow time for Q&A at the end if you would like to use that feature as well. So if we want to begin with that question of what are Santos, Sarah, do you want to start us off?
I do. If we can enlarge that, um, Santos, Bultos, retablos, reredos, four words that intersect, but we'd love to hear from you, lady professionals. What's the difference? And how can we find examples of them? Hannah, why don't you start on that one?
Sure, yeah, I can jump in. So Santos are devotional objects that originate in the 18th century in the northern New Mexico and southern Colorado region. Bultos are the three-dimensional sculptural works, and then retablos are the two-dimensional paintings on wood. So those are some kind of definitions of what you described.
And in your collection, do you have all of these, or and tell us about how many? Because I
Sure.
was amazed at the
Yeah.
number of items that you have to store and then, of course, care for.
Yeah, sure. So, to my knowledge, it is the largest collection of Santos in the country. We've surpassed over a thousand artifacts in the collection. So the bulk of the collection is retablos and bultos. We do have reredos or altar screens. So those are large works comprised of multiple panels, often each panel created by a different artist. We do have some items that are kind of more in the Catholic devotional, not necessarily, not technically a Santos. So we have some items related to the Penitente Brotherhood, and other works made of tin. We have many crucifixes. So some items that aren't strictly considered Santos, but the bulk of the collection, yeah, are Bultos and Retablos.
I
Oh, and
found
there's a picture of the gallery.
of your some of your more permanent displays, and I just thought it was so gorgeous how you've had these arranged, and what a wealth of little details for the visitor to look at.
Yeah. So that's an image of one half of the gallery. So in the left corner there, you're looking at representations of works from what would be called the Golden Age. So the original, when the tradition started back in the 18th century. So you see the retablos. The table is meant to represent an altar, and upon the table are multiple bultos, and then you see some crucifixes behind it, and then on either side of that are retablos by some of the most prominent and prolific artists of the Golden Age. The two paintings on the wall there on the left are actually the only two items in the collections that aren't considered Santos. One is actually by a 17th century Mexican artist working more in kind of the Renaissance painter style tradition. So we often start tours in that space just to kind of situate people. So that's Mary of the Shepherdess represented there in a Renaissance style painting. And then one of the retablos right next to it is Mary the Shepherdess in the Santos style painting. And so it creates this really this great way of kind of comparing the two. And some of the most distinctive differences that you see between the Santo New Mexico style and this more Renaissance style off the bat, I mean, there's some pretty stark differences. So the Renaissance style is an oil painting on canvas with this sort of elaborate decorative golden frame. And then the retablo would have been created out of found materials, so pine wood and cottonwood. And then all of the pigments are ground down from organic materials found in nature and plant materials. And then a gesso that's made of animal materials is applied on top to seal it in. And it's when you're in person and you're at the gallery, it's really pretty remarkable. How much they've maintained their integrity and how striking some of the colors are. So this is one side of the gallery, and then on the right is an altar screen, like I'd mentioned before. So each panel there is created by a different artist, and then there's this really beautiful cabinetry at the base that includes some tin work, and then there's a few bultos also standing on that cabinet there.
I want to
Obviously,
pause for just a second, Sarah, because I want to take a moment and say hello to Victor Goler. Thank you so much for joining us, Victor. And so, Victor, for those in the listening audience and in the future, Victor is a very well-known Santero local. And Victor, if you would like, I can actually pull you in from the audience into the panel. So you can use the chat to let me know if you would like to do that. We'd be happy to have you in the conversation. I also want to just very briefly explain that right now we're not doing screen sharing. These are back plates that we've created from photos, so we can't. Victor's up for it. Awesome. Okay, give me a second. So these are basically backgrounds, Zoom backgrounds that we've uploaded So we may be able to do a screen share if anybody, these are very informal conversations. I actually have pulled up on my desktop, Victor's Jesus on the surfboard, bull toe. So I could do a screen share at some point. Hannah could probably, I don't know, Claire, what you've got going on your desktop at the moment, but let me see what I can do. Um, Digital archive. While I'm doing this, Hannah, why don't you talk about the digital archive at Regis?
Sure, yeah. So I'd say about 80% of the works that are in our collection have been photographed and are in a digital collection. I can share a link to that. And Victor, I'm pretty excited to meet you because we actually have one of your works in our gallery. It's a depiction of Saint Ignatius de Loyola. So let me share a link.
I also want to ask Tlakael if he would like to be a panelist and join this conversation in that way. Hi, Victor.
Hello, everyone. I wasn't expecting to
Me
join
neither.
in
I'm
the conversation.
thrilled.
I was observing and just wanting to listen to what everyone have to say. And by the way, thank you for offering this venue and just really the wonderful collection that the Millicent Rogers has, because it is quite large and quite in depth with quite a bit of history. So it's nice to touch
We're losing
on
you.
this subject.
You know, Victor, I have to say that a year ago, I was working on a project, and it was a inventory project of the Santos collection. This was before Claire arrived even. And I learned so much in this deep dive of our inventory and gained such deep appreciation. And that's kind of the impetus for wanting to do this program, as I started thinking about um, our collection at Millicent Rogers in the context of other Santos collections. And with such a need for regional voice and Hispanic voice within the national voice, I felt like, wow, if the institution started sort of communicating more and sort of uplifting this larger voice of all the Santos collections that are held regionally, that we could have some amazing impact nationally. So, Claire, do you want to add to that? Do you want to talk about our collection?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Our Santos collection is approximately 400 objects and change. I say that because some of our objects, I think like Hannah was mentioning earlier, some objects will kind of get lumped into a category of Santos, but not be precisely what we're talking about when we're talking about Santos. So our collection is about approximately 400 objects. We certainly span quite a lot of time. Some of our works are quite old, into that golden era, as Hannah was mentioning. So some of them really start to give you a bit of the scope of this tradition, and then some of them move very much into the contemporary realm. So we have a huge span of subject matter, of time frames, of techniques. You start to see individual artists come out in our collection and their unique styles. So we, while not nearly as great as Regis in numbers, we do have a very rich collection here at the Millicent Rogers.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason that ours is lumped together is because it was all amassed by one individual. whose father Steele, who also did collect some native and indigenous work. But we do keep those that he collected in a separate collection, but everything that kind of, yeah, that's why they're lumped in that way, because of Father Steele. And I can speak a little bit about Father Steele and how the collection came to us. So Father Steele was earning his PhD in Santa Fe in the 1960s, and he was an English professor, and that's where he encountered, he was also a Jesuit priest, and that's where he encountered his first Santo, and he quickly became kind of enamored with this style and this art making tradition, and he started spending all of his money collecting Santos and started building relationships and friendships with Santeros and Santeras. So when he came to Regis, the collection had grown to a size that he was no longer comfortable owning it himself under a vow of poverty as a Catholic priest, so he donated it to the library. Then he continued to grow the collection up until he passed in 2010. And that's when Tom Riedel, another curator, took over the collection. So Tom retired around 2019. So I've been working with the collection for a few years. I have a lot to learn about the history, but and a lot of the artists that I know are obviously they're local, they're Colorado artists. So I'm really excited to partner with you guys in New Mexico, and I'm interested to see like what kind of collaborations that we can make across states as well.
Um, I had the pleasure of meeting and working with Father Tom Steele, which was really wonderful. I was much younger back then, but still some of the very more prominent Santeros who associated with him and scholars, really historians such as Charlie Carrillo, Marie Romero Cash, are all people who are still around and influential in the historical aspects. And I remember, seeing a lot of the pieces at the Regis and the interest in a little bit of the movement into the contemporary aspect of the devotional arts of New Mexico. So yeah, he was very influential and wrote a lot about the penitentes as well, and had a great thinking mind, Father Tom Steele, and a very generous person. So, yeah, a wonderful collection, and it's interesting in what you guys are trying to sort of bring forward. So, it is an important part, I believe, of the history of the United States, because it's a unique aspect with New Mexico and southern Colorado that really doesn't exist in other parts of the United States. A lot based on our early history here in New Mexico. So, always passionate about that subject.
If
I'd like to hear, Victor, your take on
Claire, to start us off with something of the history of when this unique area, this regional art, began to emerge. What's the timeline?
I'm sorry. I think that there was some technical issues there for a second. Could you repeat the question?
Building on what Victor was just saying about how this is such an important part of the history, not just cultural history of the Southwest in general, but of course, Southern Colorado, New Mexico in particular. Can you elucidate for us outsiders more about the exact timeline when these arts began to emerge as a separate, definable a specific thing in this area?
Sure. I think the language of specific timeline in this case is a little tricky. I think we see this as a form really branching off and there's different sort of traceable moments, but as Hannah mentioned earlier, 18th century, we start to see this kind of being perhaps a little bit of its own form. The core of this may be traced far earlier. The basic principle and the way that the narrative often goes was around Santos. And of course, this is also coming from an outsider. And I think that this is an art form in particular where to know it truly can't come necessarily from an outside perspective. So as someone who is very much outside, I'm gonna speak in that way. But the narrative that usually comes around Santos is that they are a form that, as the Catholic religion spread in the area following conquest, more and more images of Catholic saints, of the Virgin Mary, of Christ needed to be generated to fill churches in these Spanish colonial villages and towns, including the churches that were erected in native pueblos, because a big part of the Catholic movement was conversion. And so churches were placed in pueblos and people began to attend service. And as a result, images were needed. So images were generated as early as we can really trace Spanish involvement in the region. And this, of course, is even speaking to before the revolt of 1680. However, during the revolt, many images were, of course, destroyed. So we really do start to see things a little bit more 1692 and later after the Reconquest. So into the 1700s, the 18th century is when we start to have traceable objects. That form, I think, is often talked about mainly coming out of necessity, that materials were different. And as a result, if materials were different and if styles were different, therefore something not necessarily recognizable as European would emerge. I think that that is an overly simplistic way to talk about this particular art form. So generally that language of opportunity or of simply the materials that were at hand or of mixing of indigenous styles and Spanish styles, that is often the narrative that we hear. But I think that it can be a little bit more understood with more nuance as really a blending and a sort of redefining of the Catholic belief that occurred in the colonial region here in New Mexico and southern Colorado, and we really do see that in through the 18th century and beyond.
Thank you. That's
Important.
That was well said.
Yeah, I think an important difference, I know this from working with visitor experiences at the museum. We get a lot of people that don't really have any kind of construct for Southwest, for the region. And so this is all very new to them. And so we have a need to explain this different aspect of Santos that emerged. Part of the difference is because these were not purely aesthetic. These were not artists making artworks. These were devotional objects utilized in prayer as intercessors for people who were deeply faithful. And then how that has adapted and changed and grown to become an integral part of the artistic marketplace is a fascinating journey. I'd love it if Victor would speak to that a little bit.
Wait, can you ask that question again for me, please?
So when the Santos as a regional art form emerged in the late 1600s, these early works that we have, these were devotional objects. These were created by people not considering themselves artists for the aesthetic sake, like Renaissance art, but for devotional purposes.
Correct. So they were primarily done for devotional purposes. They really were. They were filling a necessity, as was mentioned earlier, in fulfilling the religious beliefs of largely the Hispanic community that was coming in. As churches were being built, small chapels, they required to be filled, obviously, with devotional pieces. And we don't call them artwork at times because the individuals that were making the pieces at this time did not necessarily consider themselves artists, although they did work in an artist type of manner, in that after the revolt, when they came back, we start to see more of almost workshops that have to be generated to create this type of work. And it required an entire community to do that. It was pre-mills. As if you wanted to make varnish, you needed someone that could distill some sort of grain alcohol. If you wanted to make glue, you had to go shoot an animal and skin it and boil that glue. And so it required an entire group of people. But they really did it primarily for devotional reasons. They never signed the pieces. It's very hard to often identify them because of that. They were rarely dated. There are instances of that, of course, and through research and different scholars, we have been able to identify and create more of a better database as to who these individuals were. But they were not necessarily trained artists in the academic sense. So that's what really creates the New Mexico style. And it wasn't until later, until the 1900s, going into the early 1900s, and maybe even slightly before that, that we see Santos becoming more of a sort of an art form a little bit more. It's a part of a commerce of economics, as we see it later on, going into the 1930s with the WPA and things like that, and of course developing to the contemporary artists of today. But it's all rooted in the cultural aspect of the devotional side of the New Mexico culture.
If I may build on what you've just said and add a slightly different aspect to it, a certain percentage of the purpose of the Santos and Reredos, etc., was education, that it was the storytelling that was offered to the native population for whom the Spanish had their mission of assimilation and transference of the religion, as well as for their own people to recount the stories that the priests were telling from the pulpit. And perhaps that's something, Hannah, if you have a minute, as the academic here, can you talk to us about how it was the storytelling that then brought the liturgy home to the populace?
Yes, sorry, I got distracted because my kiddo popped in. So the function of them in passing along the story of Catholicism, is that what you're speaking to?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I would also just want to jump back a little bit and talk about the role of the Santo, both to the artist and of the viewer or the person using it. So thinking of like the Renaissance example again, where it would have been commissioned to be hung in a home or a church, and kind of viewed from afar, these are very much like devotional objects, kind of like what we've heard, like used in prayer, used in community, hung in churches, also hung in homes, prayed to for specific, as intercessors for a specific purpose. But then, whereas in a Renaissance kind of a commission, you might consider the artist more valuable because of the skill or because of the visual appeal of the work and that they're known for their skill. Whereas with Santos, often the value of a piece would be tied to how devout the artist that made it, how devout, excuse me, the artist was that made it, because that would kind of empower it was perceived as that the Santo would be more powerful or more have more strength in and if you're praying to a Santo because you have a sick relative and you're hoping that this will cure or bring health, it's believed that the more devout that this person that made it was, the more activated that Santo would be. So that's a little bit off of track from your question. But yeah, they were very much used as tools for telling the story of Catholicism. So they're often the retablos sort of follow like a visual template. So you have the Santo front and center, often looking down, gazing down, and then there are different iconography or symbols that let you know who that Santo is and what they represent and what you might pray to them for. And then oftentimes there are elements on the outer perimeter of the retablo. Sometimes you'll see curtains, sometimes you'll see more symbolism. But some of the interesting scholarship that's happening now, I think, around some of these works is where some of those elements might have been described as decorative or just squiggly lines. I think there's a lot of research happening where people are making connections to ancient Latin traditions and ancient indigenous styles and saying, well, actually, no, that's a symbol of water, and this is the saint of the lakes. So they're making these really deep connections beyond the Catholic symbols that are telling the story, but where artists santeros are actually pulling from some of these indigenous and ancient traditions.
And I think that's sort of one of the areas that has up until this point been overlooked, but as you're saying now, the scholarship is really touching on, is that part of the tradition of Santos, an inherent part, is the idea of creating a new visual language, of really blending these things and bringing it potentially the religiosity of the material is more impactful when it is this unique visual language that really meets the people that it is encountering. It's not generated for a Renaissance European audience. It's not generated that way, not because the materials are different and not because I think sometimes a very old approach was that the skill and the sort of academic painting wasn't established in the New World, and so they couldn't paint the same way. I think it's actually very much clear that that's not the intention, and it never was the intention. It's actually much more creating this unique visual language that meets that population and really communicates something much deeper about the faith and about the maker and about the audience that is sort of to outsiders maybe subsurface, but it is baked into that imagery.
That's a great way of putting it, that the uniqueness of the materials and the area, not subservient to European traditions. It had as much to do with the faith of the person, the santero or santera, doing the carving and the painting, and then putting that faith out to the populace. That's an extraordinarily spiritual feel that well, I don't think many people realize how much it is a part of the cultural community as a whole. And based on that, Victor, would you tell us about your personal history of how you became a Santero?
Well, I first I want to add to what was being said earlier, um, uh, and just as it has evolved in a now we call it an art form, devotional art form, in New Mexico and southern Colorado. The way that it's evolved to a contemporary statement, and so you have these contemporary elements that are included in saints, and you have different artists sort of showing a little bit more political commentary and social commentary, but it's all rooted in the culture of New Mexico and how it was being very well explained by Claire, how it's part of the passion of the community, and just how everything has evolved from when it was initially sort of started as something that was necessary, uh, to now having it be a voice for a more modern community, but involving the whole sort of Santero aspect, and taking it back even a little bit further. If we talk about the penitentes, they were part of the learning process of the culture early on when priests couldn't get to different smaller communities. They expanded that knowledge to their communities through their alabados and different things that really represented that. I don't know if this sort of discussion is really about me in the sense of my history. I can tell you that I have been involved in this for 36 years. I grew up in a family of art conservators where we worked a lot with New Mexico saints, but saints from all over Mexico and Central America, the Caribbean. And that was just sort of part of the repertoire here in Santa Fe. I live in Taos now, but I just grew up with that, and I started carving saints as in high school, really as more of a hobby, as part of being brought up Catholic, and something that I sort of related to, and just evolved into me becoming, an artist and an art conservator, within dealing with the devotional arts of New Mexico primarily. So I've had the pleasure and the opportunity to work in lots of churches and with many museums and having the pleasure of dealing with other scholars. I'm not a scholar nor a historian myself, but it's that's sort of just been the basis of my journey. I've always just sort of been surrounded by it.
Thank you. Claire and Hannah, I'd like to move our discussion now into how you preserve these pieces in your collections. We've already said that the materials have been amazingly robust, and yet, of course, all wood needs some kind of humidity not to dry and crack. So, Hannah, maybe you should start talking with that with your 1,000 pieces.
Sure, yeah. So we have a temperature and humidity controlled storage vault where our archival collections are stored. But so we've written a couple of grants to support the Santos specifically. A few years ago, they were kind of tucked in the corner of the vault and on sort of book shelving. Not ideal. So we were able to write a grant to purchase some big, nice archival shelving and lined it with ethafoam and preservation materials so that they're more secure, and now they're kind of standing. The bolt holes are upright and secured with mounts. But in terms of conservation, there's been very little done in that regard. Father Steele, kind of as a novice, did some conservation work on some of the pieces, and he documented that in some of the records. But we actually just received a grant to bring a conservator to campus to kind of do a broad survey of the conservation needs of the collection. And then she's going to do a workshop for the archives team, and also some students, on condition reporting and some conservation work on some of our most at-risk collections.
Thank you. We have a wonderful comment. Tlakalel on our chat talks about the empowerment that is present in the actual piece. And he says, while crafting the devotional objects, the prayer of the craftsman, and oftentimes the craftsman in deep prayer while doing the actual making of the objects, and that there were particular songs and chants that were accompanied in a traditional manner, and being in prayer while actually doing the work. And he says that's what makes them relatable to the layman, the representing the real person with the real issues, the common man that is behind this extraordinary art that is imbued all across. It comes right out of the land as well as the religion. Claire, do you want to add something about the way you conserve our Millicent Rogers collection?
Well, I think the Millicent Rogers needs to follow in Regis's footsteps a little bit. I think we are in the early stages. We are also looking for greater resources in our collections management, grants, and so on. As it stands, the way that we care for the pieces in our collection is, like was mentioned earlier, the materials are in themselves robust. The benefit is that we have a certain amount of flexibility and habituation of the pieces to our space. Some of them have been with us very, very, very much a long time. And so they are used to the environment of northern New Mexico, of the region. So that gives us a certain amount of flexibility, but we are constantly managing and monitoring our pieces, teaching the condition reporting process, as Hannah mentioned, to my volunteers and to my staff has been really, really critical to kind of fine tune our eye in terms of change. Something that I've sort of tried to hammer home to our staff at the Millicent Rogers is that, we're really in a condition report, we're really looking to take a snapshot in time. We're really saying, okay, is this the state of this thing as it is right now? It may not be perfect, it may not be completely pristine, but we're really looking for it, hopefully, to not change over time. And so that is kind of the core of our conservation process at the moment, is really monitoring, condition reporting, maintaining the works that we have. But we are very much looking to improve our collections care all around, especially in terms of vulnerable collections and vulnerable materials, like natural materials are. They're vulnerable. So I think we have a lot to learn from our colleagues at the Regis in terms of the care of the Santos collection at the Millicent Rogers. And that's something that hopefully we can do in the future. But the collection is beautiful and has stood the test of time very, very well.
I agree that in a museum setting, these pieces fare very well. There's not a big sort of climate change like we might see in a lot of our sort of mission churches here in New Mexico, northern New Mexico, where there is no real climate control and they are managed largely by mayordomos, who clean them in different ways and stuff like that. And even then they fare really well. But I think one of the issues that has come up lately is more about taking a look at the database in the sense of identification and attributions to the different devotional artists. Many things that have come forward throughout the years with scholars and research that has been done, and some of it is hard to find even in published books and stuff like that. People like Will Roth from the Taylor Museum, or even Father Tom Steele. It's important to sort of go back through and re-identify some of the attributions of the saints. Not of the saints, excuse me. Well, that as well. But it's good to sort of go through the collection and, with different sort of figures of authority and re-identify, re-attribute, and do a quick, conservation assessment if it hasn't been done in a long time, because things have changed quite a bit throughout the years with sort of new research, and that's sort of been an issue that has come up when uh, um, pieces are brought forward from a collection and the database hasn't been really brought up forward, and then you're displaying it and it's not really quite matching up to a more modern attributions and things like that. Yeah.
One thing I just want to jump in really quickly and share that there is some really interesting and innovative work happening in at more resourced universities or museums than Regis is, but there was pretty customary for retablos to be refreshed or repainted over, even sometimes with a different saint. And so there's institutions doing basically like X-ray technology, using X-ray to see what exists under each layer, which I think is just fascinating.
Right. So through some of my conservation work, we have done that. And it is very common for pieces to be overpainted. They are frequently refurbished, not in a disrespectful way, but in a well-meant way. And it's because the pieces are used on a regular basis, and so they become damaged. To this day, that is something that happens regularly. And so, yeah, you do see a lot of overpainting, and sometimes it's overpainted by a well-known, recognized devotional artist. So, it's not something you necessarily want to remove,
Right. Yeah.
to get to what's underneath. But so, yeah, that happens regularly, quite frequently.
Which does sort of speak to the comment earlier of these objects being imbued with a special level of spiritual significance. Because the obvious question is, why not get a new panel? Why would you want to refresh something that has become degraded with time? And it's because that unique object is uniquely special and particularly significant to that particular chapel or church, and therefore would warrant that refreshing.
That's
point. I like that the object once created with that spiritual intent has a life of its own, or a spirit of its own, that is very important to preserve.
That's very true.
Victor, would you be so kind as to tell us a little bit about your preferred materials?
I'm largely, work in a traditional format, but I throughout the years have changed a little bit. In part because it takes a long time. If I started off as a complete traditionalist, brushing my own pigments, sawing a lot of things by hand and stuff like that. So I now use sort of watercolors, and I used to use Pignon sap varnish, which was a traditional type of varnish, but it has a tendency to yellow quite quickly. Within 30 years, it starts to yellow. Any kind of tree sap varnish, which is traditional in Europe, all the way to here. So now I use a more conservation style varnish that is non-yellowing and has UV protectors and is reversible if I make a mistake. And so I'm going to say I'm half traditional and half contemporary with some of my materials. I still make my own gessos with animal hide glue. I still carve a lot of things, by hand. I do use some power tools, but largely, I carve everything with regular chisels and knives and things like that. I often research all my saints and then create sketches and try to emphasize different types of attributes that a saint might have that we might not regularly know, or position them in a sort of a different composition. Is I've gone from super traditional to a little bit more contemporary in my 36-year span of being a professional artist. So this is what I do for a living, in the sense that I rely on my artwork for my sustainability.
We have a question about how long it takes. Now, obviously, it takes as long as it takes, but typically, from your inspiration to the finished piece, I would envision you might spend months. What is it usually for you?
I can tell you it takes me an average of about a month. I'd maybe create 11 or 12 pieces a year as far as the carving goes. Two-dimensional pieces, I don't think I do more than 30 or 50 in a year. You have to understand that that's combined with conservation work. So I do work a lot on, New Mexico devotional art. In the past 4 years, I've worked at the Cordova Chapel. We restored Las Trampas. We just finished with Chamita, which is in Okeowinge in San Juan Pueblo, which is where Diego Doñate landed. My output's not always I'm not a very fast carver, I can tell you that. So, and sometimes I work on a larger scale. So, but on average, maybe I can carve one piece a month, maximum. In the way that I work, my pieces are generally pretty intricate, and I'm sorry that I didn't want this conversation to be about me necessarily. I wanted to just listen in on what you guys had to say, because I'm always forever interested in the devotional arts in New Mexico and the different angles that are coming in, and the different sort of younger generation that's bringing in different input.
Well, forgive us for finding it fascinating, because of course you are. And so immediately we glom right onto your hands-on experience and the spirit that has helped you not only to create, but then this helping the various small village churches and the pueblos to conserve and refresh their own religious art. That's a whole nother conversation.
That is, and just to add to that, I just want to say that that's a very rewarding aspect, and that you have to really sort of integrate yourself into the community. And as conservators, we always hire someone from the community that we train as technicians, and so that helps integrate us all a little bit more together, but very rewarding work, for sure.
We're close to the end of our time. Karen, do you want to help wrap us up?
Yes, and I want to say, Victor, we really appreciate you agreeing to be pulled in at the last minute as a panelist. And it wasn't all about you, but we're really honored to have you come in and speak with us, partially because this is so helpful in trying to break down those barriers of you know, organizations, museums, academia, holding information. We aren't the experts. So it's really an honor to have your voice on this conversation. And I feel like we've only just barely touched on the tip of the iceberg. I would love to have more conversations um, around this topic, and especially in the new findings that are happening with symbolism and the meaning behind, basically adapting to new ideas instead of old interpretations. It's essential work. So I really want to thank you, and um, that also I want to thank Hannah for joining us. This is kind of a new thing for us to try and reach out, but I feel really strongly about trying to connect with the other organizations that hold essentially this national treasure. If you look at the collection of Santos as a whole, and what I learned in my research is that there are 8 institutions that hold more than 100 Santos, Millicent being among a very few organization. Regis certainly has the largest teaching collection. Um, the Harwood is in with that number with us, but 8 is not a large number. So we need to join hands and voices and bring to the forefront what the language of Santos, essentially. So thank you all. I do have some housekeeping business. Um, I also want to thank
We
did you want
haven't, Hannah, won't you tell us when the public is welcome to see even this small portion of your?
Yeah, well, I want to thank you, Karen, for inviting me, and I'm thrilled to meet everyone here. And I think our collection could be so much more active and is underutilized, and I'm so grateful to make a connection with you. And I will come to the museum next time I'm in Taos, and you all please come to Regis. The Santo Gallery is on the 3rd floor of the library, and it's open to the public anytime the library is open. You can visit the gallery, and there's about 300 pieces in the gallery. But just email me or call me, and I would be happy to pull any pieces that you see in the digital collection and you're interested in seeing, and even pop in our vault and see what our storage looks like. I would love to do that.
Thank you, Hannah.
Wonderful.
So, and thank you, Claire, for joining us again on this conversation. I know we've pulled you into a lot of Millicent Unplugs recently, and much appreciated. I do want to say that the museum is now on winter schedule, which means we're closed on Wednesdays. We're open 10 to 5 to Thursday through Tuesday. Um, Also, our annual holiday fiesta community day will be held Saturday, December 7th from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. This is a free event to the public featuring holiday arts and crafts activities, music, snacks, and other holiday festivities. And I will mention that Tlakael is going to have a craft for kids to make. So he promises me it's going to be a good one. And really many thanks to all of you. I'll have this recording uploaded to our YouTube channel after I get back from vacation. And then I'll share it with you.
Yes, that it is, even if one is not Catholic, these pieces are a spiritual part of our Western culture and persona that I find extraordinarily important. And I'm going to be looking for one to grace my house as soon as I can.
Without a doubt, you don't have to be Catholic. You just have to have, you want a patron saint of lawyers because you're a lawyer, or you want a patron saint of cyclists because you're a cyclist. Why not? It just empowers you.
Okay. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.